chapter 24 comes before chapter 22. So we'll go to chapter 24. And chapter 24 bears an interesting title. I've translated it as Troubling Eagerness. There used to be a phrase in the 1950s, gung-ho. Somebody who was gung-ho was too much on the ball, was too much after something. Lao Tzu uses an interesting double phrase for that kind of activity. I've translated it as spoiled food, waste sister. The whole chapter has curious overtones, as if this kind of over-eagerness to act is like someone spoiling food when you're cooking. Instead of letting the food really achieve its nourishment. It's like the Midwest way of cooking green beans when I was a boy was to boil them until they were absolutely dead. If there was any kind of snap or taste to them, they were not right. They went back and were cooked again until they were limp and gray, and then they were served. It was one of the prime reasons for little boys learning to like pepper. Because it was impossible to eat that kind of food. It's why peanut butter came into great vogue in the 40s, because vegetables were killed. They were never served alive. And there was no nourishment whatsoever. The water in which they were cooked, which was thrown away, had all of the vitamins and minerals. And so Midwest American mothers of the 1940s were proper subjects for this chapter, troubling eagerness. It's not that the mothers hated their children and wanted to do in the food value. They loved their children and wanted the food cooked. And the whole idea was that it has to be well cooked before you can serve it to them. Their food should be cooked. And so they went overboard, and they cooked and cooked and cooked until the vegetables were dead, and the meat was burnt, and the potatoes were dried out. And then, having killed all the bacteria that might harm their children, they would serve this as the meal. This is the quality that's here, that Lao Tzu says, too many people troubled with eagerness spoil the Tao. One of the translations, Wing-Sit Chan's translation is, he who stands on tiptoe is not steady. He who strides forward does not go. He who shows himself is not luminous. He who justifies himself is not prominent. He who boasts of himself is not given credit. He who brags does not endure for long. Another translation of this, Chang Chun Yuan, to lift the heel is not to stand. To take long strides is not to walk. To show off is not to shine. To insist that one is right is not to be distinct. To claim credit is to have no credit. To be proud of oneself is not to be the best. And then there are 4 more lines. I have translated this in this way. Tiptoes themselves, not stand. Striding itself, not walks. Self-show-off itself not bright. Self-showing assertion itself not radiant. Self-approving itself nothing's merit. Self-praising itself not resonant. So the general sense in this chapter 24 is that when you try to overdo, it's a sure sign that you're not going to do it. Not going to do what? You're not going to be in the Tao. Why? Because the Tao flows. And the popular Zen saying is that you cannot push the river. You cannot jump into the river and push against the water and make it flow faster. And the more that you try to do that, you're going to just raise mud from the bottom of the river and muddy up the flow, which will be no faster because you've pushed it. So that the wisdom sense here is that the flow has its own articulate pacing. Thoreau talks about how we often in this world missee someone who walks to a different drummer, whose pace of life does not fit the reactive, frenetic pace of life. We think they're wasting time. But Thoreau says they're actually walking to a different drummer, an inner drummer, whose pace is not hectic like this world, but just right. As some great writer in the English early 18th century, Lawrence Sterne, said, a really interesting novel should be exciting in exciting parts and calm parts. And the language should vary and modify itself according to wherever and whatever is happening. And so the Tao has its own flow, its own ecology. This troubling eagerness to try to make oneself not just taller by standing on tiptoes, but to try to make one's standing more refined by going on tiptoes, misunderstands the whole realization of balance. The striding to try and get ahead is not walking. In the sense that you're trying to hurry to get someplace. It may not be right for you in the Tao of your life to get there any sooner. It may be that your arrival at just such a moment incorporates something of that moment for you in that experience, which is the treasure for you, the pleasure, the preciousness for you. So that you cannot tell in little snippets of life what's right. But you can tell in those little snippets that rushing and pushing and pretending are never going to allow you to experience what is right, which in all cases is to flow with the Tao. Or as my late good friend Kai Di used to call me, roll with the Tao. In the sense that there's a kind of like a wave sequence, a pulse rhythm in the way in which the Tao occurs. And one gets used to being with the pulse rhythm, with the surf roll. And if you do, you come to see that wherever it is that you are in this motion, that's exactly right for you because that's exactly where you are. If you're in the water and wishing you were on shore, it's no better than being on shore and wishing you were in the water. And being eager to get into the water from the shore desecrates both the water and the shore for you, in the sense that neither really just occurs as they really are, and you cannot occur with them. So this translation, tiptoes themselves, not stand. You cannot stand on tiptoes. You can raise up on tiptoes. You could practice as a ballerina and do that step, but you cannot stand for any extended time. You cannot carry that through a whole day, much less through a lifetime. Lao Tzu will come back to this. He will come back to this in the parallel to 24, which is chapter 23, and its title is Empty Non-Existence, in which he will say, wild wind not outlasts the morning, fierce rain not outlasts the day. So chapter 24, Troubling Eagerness, after it goes through a series, in the Ma Wang Tui there are only 5 lines. In the regular tradition of the Tao Te Ching, there are 6 lines. It's like there's a series of 5 or 6 lines that show again and again that you cannot over-eagerly make life happen any faster than it really needs to be. And then Lao Tzu says these 5 or 6, these with Tao, indeed called spoiled food waste system. Beings likely to reject them. Therefore, having Tao itself not lean thereon. Now it seems very simplistic at first that if you're in the Tao, don't lean on it. But the human tendency is self-reflective. Our consciousness, the nature of consciousness, is to come back upon itself. And it's like somebody trying a high wire balancing act and just getting it right becomes conscious of the fact that they're balanced, and then it becomes very difficult to maintain it. Just as soon as you start to pay attention, there are an infinite number of little corrections that are needed, and it's a sure sign you're going to fall. So the first thing that Transylvanian trapeze artists learn is don't think about it. If you can't do it, stay off the wire. If you can, just go. In the motion of the trapeze artist, my late great friend Theodore Sturgeon, science fiction writer, started out as a high wire trapeze artist in the circus. And he said, when you are flipping through the air blind, 75 feet above the ground, and you have let go of the last hand that holds you, and you're doing a 1.5 tuck to reach other hands that you cannot see, you cannot reach for them as if you were going to find them. You will miss them if you reach for them as if you're trying to find them. If you simply go with the flow of the rhythm, because everyone's in a kind of a syncopated rhythm, if you stay in the rhythm, you cannot miss those other hands. He said it is incredible to realize you cannot miss those other hands. If you stay within the rhythm, you cannot miss them. Successful big league pitchers know that as soon as they try to overthrow, even the 20-year veteran is going to throw a ball. You cannot throw strikes, overthrow it. It is impossible. You cannot put something extra on the ball. That's radio commentator pizzazz. A major league pitcher knows he has to stay within himself. You'll hear it all the time. What does he mean, within himself? It means the rhythm of the delivery, of the motion, of preparing, and the letting go of the throw is a part of that motion. And the carry through is what makes a professional pitcher, that you continue the motion of carrying through. And you can throw strikes forever that way. You can be watching the runaround first, thinking of the runaround second, glancing at the runaround third, and throw strikes without ever having looked at the plate. Why? Because if you stay within the articulation of the rhythm, you cannot miss. It is impossible to miss. We in our time did a kind of a construct that's somewhat similar to this in the Jungian idea of synchronicity, of things happening at the same time, happening rightly because they occur at the same time. But in terms of the Tao, synchronicity is a kind of a causality removed from space to time, and that's wrong also. That there is no causality whatsoever. There's no temporal causality, there's no spatial causality. Why? Because what actually is occurring is a correspondence of resonances that belong together because they are real together. And that the only way that they fly out of being together is if there is a resistance of a troubled, eager ego trying to push the river. The only actions that fall out of the rhythm of a natural ecology are the man-made attempts to try and correct it, as in doing better in this sense. Now this does not fly in the face of the whole idea of man developing new and better processes out of nature. Taoism is not saying we have to just stay within the natural limits and that's it. But there is no idea of progress in Taoism whatsoever. Chinese acupuncture as a medicinal practice is not considered progressive, man improving on nature, but another way in which man participates in the rhythms of nature. And so the whole Taoist notion of correspondence comes into play here. And the largest correspondence is when all of the 5 phases of an energy cycle are strung together. That's a harmony. And when they are strung together as a harmony, they are real together. So that whatever actually really happens has only this harmonic manifestation in which it can actually happen. So that the Taoist view of nature is not that nature is chancy or risky. One is not gambling, hoping that nature is going to work out. It always works out in terms of exactly what the real correspondence is. So that for the Taoist, the understanding that's needed is to tune one's self to what's going on here, now. To become present in the manifest situation that actually is occurring. There's a phrase in Chuang-Tzu, joy and anger occurring as naturally as the 4 seasons. We would think, well, you've got to not show anger. That's very bad Taoist who shows anger, when actually that's not the issue at all. Or like an old friend of mine who went to China in the 1920s as the first American apprentice to a Chinese Buddhist. And he went from Honolulu, and he was a member of a very wealthy American family that owned department stores. And he got there to Shanghai, and the Buddhist master that greeted him, he thought was some slovenly porter whose nose was running, he had old clothes on and he had pulled down, and he wanted to be taken immediately to the master. He didn't recognize this was the master. This was the Taoist master. That the vision that somehow someone is excerpted from life and that makes one a master is completely erroneous. That has nothing to do with the real at all. But to be in one's consciousness exactly what you are, because that is how reality has come at this particular juncture of correspondences to actually occur, to be actually there with that, however that is, that's being masterful. So Lao Tzu says, having Tao itself, not lean thereon. Don't achieve this quality of thusness and then thinking that you've achieved it, relax. Because if you haven't relaxed in the achievement of it, if you have achieved it through some kind of construct, like standing on your tiptoes, it's not really the Tao. It's some idea of the Tao, some image of the Tao, some version of the Tao. If you have to lean on it, like test it to make sure that it's going to be all right, that's not it at all. In chapter 22, which is entitled Increase Humility, Lao Tzu then turns to this very interesting issue. Increase humility. Not to go for troubling eagerness, but to increase humility. This is the translation that I have. Distorted, then restored. Crooked, then straight. Empty, then filled. Worn, then renewed. Little, then te. Much, then puzzle. Therefore, holy gem, spirit gem, embraces oneness, becomes heaven-earth matrix. Not himself seen, therefore bright. Not himself stressed, therefore eminent. Not himself boasted, therefore has merit. Not himself asserted, thereby ascertained. For busy not quarreling, thereby heaven earth never can with itself quarrel. The sense that Lao Tzu has here, when we are in the Tao, because the correspondences, because the resonances are really interesting. It's like when you're really in the flow of something, every aspect of what's happening is of interest. It's like a runner who's struggling with their muscles, struggling with their breathing, struggling, attains to their second wind. And the whole physiological struggle subsides and fades where? It fades into the activity that you're doing. So that when one has this physiological phenomenon of getting a second wind, a second breath, if you are really into that, your body in that second wind, your body in that kind of a quality is in the Tao. And the activities, if you wish to bring your consciousness into play, your activities occur as if they were orchestrated perfectly. And your consciousness can float above those activities, or it can be absorbed into those activities, and it's the same quality. One can abstract consciousness from the body's seamless activities in that second wind, and consciousness abstracted from it occurs just above the cranium. It doesn't occur in the mind. It occurs above the Saharastra chakra, right above your head. It's as if you were outside of yourself, looking at yourself whole, or looking at yourself in that situation. One of the most daring of all of the Vajrayana therapies, a kind of a yoga which stresses the psychophysical energy system to an ultimate. It's a kind of a happening that occurs in one of the Bardo states after death, where the whole psychophysical energy system rises suddenly all the way through the system and bursts out. Whereas if one were still in a bodily form, it would be like an aura. It would be like a radiance, called in the Bible the glory of a person. It occurs above that physiological person. One is abstracted from that, and one could come back into that body. One could come back into one's physiology without leaving a single trace of the abstraction remaining. That's like the returning back to the Tao. That's like going out in just the right way that one can come back in seamlessly. And you could practice, you could actually physiologically and psychologically, you could psychophysically take yourself in a rhythm of going out and coming back. You could do that. So that Lao Tzu in chapter 22 says, distorted, then restored. Crooked, then straight. Empty, then filled. Worn, then renewed. Little, then take. Much, then puzzle. Therefore, holy gem, or spirit gem. Gem, our third phase of the energy cycle. Our sense of kinesthetic balancing, our sense of being in ourselves as we participate in the Tao of the activity. That embraces the oneness and becomes a heaven-earth matrix, where instead of the polarity that usually occurs, the two come together in a complementation. And in that complementation, the Hermetic adage was as above, so below, but it's usually misunderstood. It isn't as above, so below in a parallel. It's as above in the above way, so below in the below way, that when they come together, when they turn together, they lock together, as it were, one being the key for the other, and the other being the key for the first. And in this complementation, they are as each other on an exchange quality. They work together as a unity. They come together to one thing. In the Buddhist metaphysics, in the Abhidhamma, in the high yogic teachings of the Buddha that usually were not given to lay people, but only put into very advanced, almost esoteric type teaching. In the Abhidhamma, there's this quality of seeing, that the flame does not occur out there separate from me. My seeing of it and the flame being of itself are one thing. They come to be a single event, as it were. And that singleness of event is what is real. The event in its component parts, in its conditioned quality, is highly temporary. That particular flame is now long since gone. That incandescence of those particular gases are long since gone. The flame is different. I'm seeing it different. The coming together in oneness, that point, that's within the participation of the Dhamma. Not himself seen, therefore bright. Not himself stressed, thereby eminent. Not himself boasted, thereby has merit. Not himself asserted, thereby ascertained. For busy not quarreling, thereby heaven earth never can with itself quarrel. Now here's the translation of this from Hendricks. Just to give you a contrast, this is 22. Bent over, you'll be preserved whole. When twisted, you'll be upright. When hollowed out, you'll be full. When worn out, you'll be renewed. When you have little, you'll attain much. With much, you'll be confused. Now that's a very careful translation, but that in itself is confusing. That is hard to follow, that language. And that language rightly ends in the word confused. Here's how Wing-Sit Chan translates that. This is chapter 22. To yield is to preserve, to be preserved whole. To yield is to be preserved whole. To be bent is to become straight. To be empty is to be full. To be worn out is to be renewed. To have little is to possess. To have plenty is to be perplexed. Now what's wrong with this language? Hendricks' translation is confusing, but Wing-Sit Chan's translation is paradoxical. Now what is paradox? Paradox is when a polarity comes together in a non-resonant way. When polarity is brought together in a non-resonant way, you have a kind of an alternation of viewpoints characteristic of an optical illusion, like an M.C. Escher print. You can see it one way, the gray birds are flying into the white mist, or the white birds are flying into the gray mist. It can work either way. That's a paradox. And that kind of paradox is an optical illusion, and it has to do with not resolving polarity. With polarity structurally and thus subconsciously still operative. One on the surface only has brought things together And so they are seen to be paradoxical. So we have to pay attention that there is a radical difference between resolving polarity so that a complementation occurs from a pseudo solving of polarity and having a paradox result. The difference is this, that a complementary whole occurs because of a transformation, whereas a paradox occurs because of a mechanical juxtaposition, as in optical illusion. We had last week the illustration of a Tai Chi done in a Neo-Confucian way. There was a circle, and then there was a circle within that, and then a circle within that. So you had 3 concentric circles. Now you split them exactly in half so that 3 halves are dark and 3 halves are light. Now, if you take the middle circle and you rotate it 180 degrees so that the black half of the middle circle rotates into the white and the white rotates into the black, you have a mechanical distribution, but you do not have a transformation. Thus, the symbol is not a symbol of the Tao. It is a symbol of the paradox of polarities in an optical illusion seeming like the Tao. The mechanical distribution is what we would call, in our culture, in our time, seemingly a good idea. But you cannot live with those kinds of seeming good ideas. They're only good on paper. They're only interesting in a mechanical way. They do not have anything to do with life. And more especially, they have no effect on the real whatsoever. So that someone who learns to mechanically distribute your physiological energy with another person in no way will ever, to all eternity, even approximate love by that method. You cannot do that. It is a totally different thing. Whereas the secret exchange of energies between 2 people in love is the Tao. The difference here is that whenever a paradox comes up, like when Chan's translation yields paradoxical English, it means that the mind making that translation does not experience the transformation, so that there's no complementation that happens, but only the paradox. The Neo-Confucian mind is a wonderfully sophisticated mechanical redistribution which simulates the Tao, but is not the Tao. It gives a simulation of it, not the real thing. It's like the political candidates this year are good simulations of candidates, but they are not candidates. Which is obvious to, some 100 million people by now. That problems that are real are there, and no simulated approach to them is going to do anything at all. So that is a waste of time to refine simulations. As the Buddha said so eloquently many times in his sermons, when the house is on fire, do not argue about who the arsonist is. The important thing for you is to get out of the house. Notice here that one of the qualities that comes out of true transformation is that instead of paradox, one gets a kind of a sense of what was called in literary form allegory. One gets an allegorical quality instead of a paradoxical quality. The allegorical quality is that one is able to read into something else that's also there, but not apparently present until one reads it in, and then one can see it there. And the first indication in human experience that you're making the transformation, because the very first level before allegory becomes operative, is that you begin to develop a sense of irony. The sense of irony is the beginning of wisdom. When you can see the ironical aspect of something, or of someone, or of yourself, that's the beginning that the transformation is starting to happen. Things are not just statically what they were, but there's a kind of a twist to them. An ironical twist. Isn't it interesting, one thinks to oneself, look at this. Look at what's happening. Isn't that interesting? And the interest that's there is because of the irony that begins to develop. That's an indication always that you're beginning the transformation. What transformation? The only transformation there is. The transformation of coming back into correspondent sync with the Tao. Coming back into the way things really are. The greatest of all the Roman physics writers was a very great poet too. His name was Lucretius. And his book is called De Rerum Natura. A good English translation of that is The Way Things Are. This quality, Lao Tzu develops whenever he uses that kind of language where he will say something and then turn the language around and say it the other way. He's showing that there's no paradox here, but that there is a complementation, and he's trying to elicit from us, trying to quicken, to awaken in us a sense of irony. Isn't that interesting? That you can say this way, and then also it has an extra meaning by saying it the other way. This complementation that develops finally out of a deeper sense of irony that becomes allegorical, one begins to see how you can read the one into the other. You can read one into the other. They go together. And that's a deeper sense than irony. And the next step from that is the sense of complementation, that they go into one another because they belong together. Or you can keep yourself somewhat skeptically distant. It isn't that they go into one another without effort because they belong together, but because they can be that way. They could be apart, but they could also be together. It's like two human beings discovering that they can be together. Is extraordinary discovery. Yes, one can be separate, oh yes, and then one can also be together. Extraordinary. That both states are real, and therefore, thereby, as Lao Tzu would say, thereby one can conclude, one can come to understand that we are malleable in the sense that we can be individual and we can be together. That we have both capacities, and that therefore we have a range of reality that includes the individual and the being together. And one can discover that one can be together with a whole room full of people. But there is such a thing as a community. And Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, one discovers eventually in the grandeur of realization that all human beings have the possibility, there is a state of reality where they would all be one. They would be a single resonance. So Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching, and we're going to get to it in just a little bit, he says that the only way to talk about this on this scale is to call it Ta, great. And as Tao is great, obviously heaven in its oneness is great. The earth in its oneness is great. And man and his oneness is great. 4 greats. Let's pause there and quote. We'll finish it. Are we in our language? Let me illustrate the interesting point at which we have reached, because the very next chapter of the Tao Te Ching is going to be called Empty Non-Existence. So I need to tell you a little wisdom story. A wisdom story from ancient Persia, or not so ancient Persia. It concerns a teacher, a mullah, named Nasruddin. Some of you have heard this story. It's the perfect wisdom story to talk about emptying non-existence. There's a crowd of people who come to hear the wise mullah Nasruddin. And he comes in, and he stands up in the front, holding his captain close to him, and he's holding his arms straight, and he says to the bright-eyed audience, "Do you know what I am going to talk about?" And one representative person says, "Yes, mullah, we do." And the mullah says, "Well, in that case, I don't have to say any more." And he leaves the podium and goes to leave. And they beseech him, as Persians who are desperate to find out what you know will beseech you, "Please, mullah, please, do not leave." And he assures them that he will return on the next day, the same time. And the next day, the same crowd, or perhaps even larger, is gathered. And he, of course, goes immediately up to the front of the congregation and addresses them with exactly the same question, same tone of voice. "Do you know what I'm going to say to you?" And the representative this time says, "No, mullah, we don't." And he says, "Well, there's no sense in me trying to tell you anything." And he, of course, leaves, and he's out the door, and the beseechers are following down the road, and he mutters, "I'll be back one more time. Tomorrow, when the 3rd day arrives, the crowd is stupendous at this time. The tension you could almost cut with a knife." And Mullah Nasruddin takes his fabled place at the head, and he asks the magic question, "Do you know what I am going to talk about today?" And the representative stands up in all humility, hands, head slightly bowed, and says, "Mullah, some of us do, and some of us don't," as good Persians will. And the mullah says, "Well, those who know will tell those who don't." Very wise old Turk told me that story. As one begins to address oneself to what is not there, it magically begins to occur. It's like if you ever saw a very good mime, like Marcel Marceau. As soon as he makes sure that you see that his actions and his gestures are presenting you with something, it's there. And if he would drop it, it would be a shame. The very comportment that something is there makes a frame of reference. The frame of reference can be referred to in language as an as-if state. This frame of reference, in its as-if state, can be gestured to, can be worked with, could be talked about, and even though there is no content, the frame of reference delimits an object already. Why? 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 Because the habitual worldly way of identifying a thing is by drawing a boundary around it. The whole process of definition is defining it by drawing the boundaries. And as soon as you've drawn the boundaries, even if there is nothing there, by drawing the boundaries, one has created the thing in its frame of reference, needing only to be filled in by some actual object. This is a serious mental error. A serious mental error. And the most serious aspect of it is to think that non-existence is a thing. So that one uses language like non-existence, and we suppose that there is some referential to that. Oh, the non-existent. Ooh. Or if you're a Zen freak, A very wise ancient Greek from a little tiny town named Elea, by the name of Parmenides, astonished the classical Greek rational world in its infancy by saying, look, fellas, what is, and what isn't, isn't. And that mutually disjunctive polarity in a logical form is unsolvable because it is an ultimate paradox. And in order to deal with that, in order to mentally cope with that condition of a mutually disjunctive polarity, there are only two ways to go. One can ignore the formal structure and try to force a situation, in which case one gets the optical illusion and paradoxical kind of jammer. Or you can transform the horizon at which structure is operative into a transcendent matrix. Like you can take the plane of discourse upon which the structures of polarity occur and generate a larger, more dimensional sphere, a theater of operations, a kind of a metaphor, meta plane, in which case one can then transform the mutually disjunctive polarity into a larger complementarity. You can do two things then. You can create illusion, or you can create transformation. This is the fundamental pair of processes that occur when polarities are thrown at you. You can create illusion, or you can create transformation. And it's like a choice. It's like the ultimate structure of the choice between right and wrong, true and false. If you choose illusion, you have to go to the dunce's chair and live in a life of ignorance. If you choose transformation, you can continue to learn. It's not the ultimate learning. It's not like super enlightenment. It's not like ultimate realization, it simply means that you can continue to learn. Whereas the illusion choice stops learning, freezes possibility in such a way that the ultimate that you could hope for is to have the perfect paradox, to have the most believable illusion. So that one would be very glad to say, well, they'll never be able to tell that this is not true. And that's the state of politics in 1992. It's like all the little sound bites are polished up and doctored up so that the illusion seems the best that one can do. And if you're hungry, all the best that one can say about job possibilities has no effect upon the fact that you're not going to eat. So that illusion, the way of illusion, is the way of the world trying to approximate Tao. How does the world try to approximate Tao? It tries to make a sixth phase to that energy cycle. Instead of the world flowing back into the Tao, one tries to squeeze more out of the world than is there. One troubles with eagerness, tries to stand on one's tiptoes to be more prepared. One thinks, well, I have made a great spiritual progress because I'm now going to be more prepared. I'm going to really get on top of this. I'm going to tear hell out of my problems because I'm really going to be good, and I'm going to have all these other preparations. And in this mechanical way of trying to distribute all the good little polished activities, one hopes that one's going to, by this buckshot, hit the target. But the target is not there. It's a flow. And all that your buckshot approach does is that it tatters the scene, produces lots of little holes, and the Tao unseen flows through and by and past and gone. And of course, the psychic sensitivity of a person for every human being has spirit gen. No one is bereft of that. No one is bereft of that. On a deep, deep subconscious level, experiences abandonment. Life has abandoned me. It's much worse than the severe depression that comes when a loved one has abandoned one. A mother, a father, a husband, a wife. This abandonment is like primordial. It's like the soul itself now has been left behind and tries to make up for that by reaching beyond the world into that sixth phase, trying to squeeze something else out, thinking that that's where the Tao went. Instead of understanding that the Tao has circulated back again, has returned. Why? Because the transformation is like a turning point. It's like a pivot. The polarity that was in parallel turns so that the complementation, like the hands that come together, the ancient Greek symbol of the two hands coming together like that, is always the primordial classical Greek realization, like the Tai Chi. This is how complementation happens in transformation. The two which were parallel turn and come together and make a whole. And that whole is of such a nature that it reoccurs in a rhythm of articulate pulsation. So that the Greek design of the hands coming together was never just one, but was an endless row of them. Those squares coming like square hands to meet squares. And there was this waveform ripple of the geometricity of the geometry of wholeness. It was a realization that could be put into symbols. It could be lived. And when one looks at the records of dance movements of the time, we have jars and amphora in museums, red figure and black figure, Greek paintings on these vases. And one can see in the dance movements, in the very shapes of the bodies of the human beings, one can see that they were in the Tao. In fact, I once did a presentation in Berkeley on slide of showing black figure vase painting from the 5th and 6th century BC in Athens that showed all of the movements of Tai Chi Chuan. Because once movement is in the ecology of the way in which the body is real, there are universal postures, universal gestures, universal movements that come together, and the human body, being universal, expresses itself in a language of eternal symbolic exactness. One could never miss it. Once you have yourself participated with that, you can forever after recognize it again. It's like once you have raised a little baby to the stage where it talks, every baby that one comes to see, you understand that baby. You have a feel for that baby. You could pick up where you left off. You could hold a 8-month-old baby in your arms and you would remember, your body would remember what to do, how to do it. And the baby has this shift of phase when held by somebody who knows how to hold it. The baby shifts phase and is with that person. And is so ultimate. It is so recognizably ultimate that one of the great sculptors of the 20th century, Henry Moore, the English sculptor, did a whole series of women holding babies and then took the babies out of the arms of the women and left a kind of a nest-like hole. So that the women would have this, not the mind holding of a baby, but the universal gesture of holding the baby. There's a difference. The one would be promoting the illusion that there's a baby there. The other is the symbol that the baby is there. That woman in that posture is always with a baby. Even if you don't see one there, she is always with a baby. It's that kind of a quality that is there beyond paradox in the transformed complementation of the whole. So that when one talks about wholeness, one is not talking about a mechanically distributed wholeness. Not like somebody who has a deck of cards of possibilities and says, now everybody's going to get 7 cards. That is a form of gambling. There's no equanimity in that process ever. You could practice that for 2 billion years in 9 stellar systems and never come out with equanimity, much less the kind of social equality that is resonant with equanimity. There can be no mechanical distributing. That ends up not with equanimity, but with equivocation, which is a mathematical form of paradox. And the worst form of equivocation is the illusion that one believes that your identity is that I am I. I am I, and therefore, and therefore, and therefore, and therefore. That sense of identity, that identification, is a mechanical redistribution that makes of oneself ultimately a paradox. and there's no possibility of realization. You could pound that person with rods of discipline from here to eternity, and they would never realize themselves. Because it is not possible in that condition for realization to occur at all. So Lao Tzu, in his 23rd chapter, Empty Non-Existence, see if we can hear it now, says it this way: rarely speech is just so. Wild wind not outlasts morning. Fierce rain not outlasts the day. Who, busy just as itself, heaven, earth even not can persist, yet less for man, indeed. Therefore pursue business with Tao itself, Tao itself. Now notice that Lao Tzu's language here, and I'm not doing a very good academic translation at all. I handed this in at English 1A in any university, they would say awkward. F. You can't write. Why? Because no one ever says itself, Tao itself. It's like saying equals A equals. Everyone knows that the identification of a thing is that A equals A. And the precocious, logical genius kid says A equals A is tautological, and I'm trying to say something which is real. I'm not trying to make sense on the level of mechanical distribution of meaning. I'm trying to present rather than represent. Instead of trying to represent identity, I'm presenting wholeness. Equals A equals. I turn the A equals A inside out. How did you turn it inside out? I took the paradox and transformed it into a complementation by turning it inside out. If you turn a paradox inside out, if you hold a mirror up to a paradox, you get a very interesting condition. Because a self-reflective paradox cannot maintain its stasis. When you reflect a paradox to itself, the paradox of a paradox throws it to a higher level, throws it to a meta level. It becomes an exponential of itself. And when a paradox becomes exponential of itself, it undergoes transformation. It gains power. It gains a power of perspective, which is a new whole. If one could follow it intellectually, it's like a Hegelian synthesis. One comes out on the high side of where the paradox still was maintainable into a meta realm, into an allegorical sphere where the paradox can no longer be maintained strictly as a paradox. It becomes ironical and begins to generate a kind of peculiar meaning which results in the capacity of the observer or the thinker to entertain wholeness on a larger level, an amplified level. So that Taoism, later on in Chinese history, when it came into juxtaposition with the refined Buddhist logic of India, the Taoists of China, learning to talk with the refined logicians of Buddhist India, developed Chan, Buddhism, developed Chinese Zen, developed the sense of laughing at the problem. Because the problem can only maintain itself, like Mullah Nasruddin's audience, as long as you're bedeviling it, as long as you keep nibbling at the bone, it's going to remain there. So the whole procedure is to let it go. And letting it go is a radical solution. Why radical solution? Because as long as you were dealing with the problem, you were looking for the solution. When you let go of the problem, the solution was that there was no problem in the first place. And what comes out of that is the laughter of the Chinese sages like Han Shan, whose poems from a place called Cold Mountain in north central China are famous in Chinese literature, of showing that the mirroring of paradox to itself is an awakening moment of realization. The Japanese, courtesy of a genius named Dogen, who lived about 1200 AD, took this technique and refined it in Japan and came up with the technique of the koan. The pithy little saying, which the mind, in its mechanical distribution of meaning, cannot deal with, and eventually will have to just let it go. So the Japanese refined the Chinese technique to these pithy little aphoristic questions, like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And as long as you're hearing in your paradoxical imagination, in your illusion, clapping, you can never hear the sound of one hand clapping because there's no sound. So as long as you're trying to hear what the clapping of one hand would sound like, you will never hear the silence that one hand clapping has. As long as you keep struggling with the problem, the answer will be paradoxical and will elude you to the extent that you pursue it. The more you pursue it, the more it will elude you. The more you try to grab it, the farther it goes. Lao Tzu is the granddaddy. He's the grandfather. He's the wise beginning of human consciousness squaring away this situation and coming to understand it exactly in the way it really occurs. And it is so peculiar, not because it's paradoxically mysterious, but because all of the paradox transforms into exactness. That's what's mysterious about it. So that chapter 23 and chapter 25, which sort of go together in this way, are the most difficult sections in all of the Tao Te Ching. Because chapter 25 is the original Chinese classical cosmology. And chapter 23 is the correspondence that brings it into play. So even though the Ma Wan Tui manuscripts takes chapter 24 out and puts it before chapter 22, so it reads 24, 22, 23, 25. The great Chinese wisdom sages of the time of Prince Luan, Prince of Huainan, Prince Liu, put chapter 24 in between chapter 23 and chapter 25 so that the two chapters would have this kind of syncopated resonance that carries throughout the Tao Te Ching. Let me read 23 and 25 unbroken together in my translation so you can get the flow of this. This is very arcane, but it's arcane not because it's paradoxical, but arcane because he is speaking exactly. He's using language in this kind of transcendent way to say exactly what he presents to us. So that you cannot hear this language and think that, wonder what it means. Because this language doesn't mean anything else. It means what it says. It just takes a little getting used to the fact that for the first time, as far as I can see in human history, somebody managed to use language with a logical preciseness that got underneath the paradoxical limitations of worldly referent and got into the spiritually resonant way in which language can be used. Lao Tzu is one of the world's greatest minds. His language is one of the most sophisticated languages possible for human beings. It's this level of language in Lao Tzu 2,500 years ago that was recovered in the early 20th century by a physicist named Niels Bohr, who introduced the idea of complementarity into nuclear physics and completely blew out the Einstein relativity qualities of looking at reality and brought in the quantum mechanics, amazingly labeled mechanics, because there's nothing mechanical about quantum mechanics. And 20th century nuclear physics is a Tao language. No doubt about it whatsoever. And describes what is really there to the nth degree. With a mechanically distributed language, the best that man could ever have done was done by somebody like William Clerk Maxwell, in which one talked about fields, using an insight from Michael Faraday. But as soon as Niels Bohr began to talk Tao about atomic and subatomic structure, it wasn't very long before his students like Heisenberg or Schrödinger were able mathematically to show that one can talk exactly in such a way that paradox transforms into complementation. For those who follow this in the more extended audience, Schrödinger's waveform equations about light show the mathematical exactness with which one can either talk about particles or waves. The mathematics either way carries through to the nth degree, and with specificity that can be measured to the last iota of detail. And nowhere, at no level of boundary, does that complementation disappear, become shaky, dissolve. It holds all the way into eternity. Here's Lao Tzu, 2,500 years ago, talking that talk. The two chapters are empty, non-existence, and imaging the mysterious. Rarely speech, just so. Wild wind not outlasts morning, fierce rain not outlasts day. Who, busy just as itself, heaven, earth even, not can persist, yet much less for man? Indeed. Therefore pursue business with Tao. Itself, Tao itself, identical with Tao. Pursue business with Te, itself identical with Te. Pursue business with loss, itself identical with loss, identical with down, itself down also. Enjoy te, itself identical with te, also enjoy te, itself identical with loss, itself loss. Also enjoy te, itself heartfulness, not sufficient, indeed, receive not heartfulness. I know it's difficult. Stay with it. There being everything's completion before heaven and earth exists, calm, oh, incorporeal, oh, alone, stands, yet not changes, everywhere goes, yet not resisted, can thereby become heaven, earth's mother. I not know its name, characterize itself, called Tao. Forest, become name itself, called great. Great, called elusive. Elusive, called distant. Distant, called returning. For great, heaven great, earth great, king also great. This world has four greats, yet king dwells therein as one only. Gem follows earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows Tao, Tao follows its self-sowness. That's a lot. There's no doubt about it. In all of Chinese history, there's not a single page more difficult than this. In all of Chinese philosophy, one cannot run across anything more abstruse than this. And yet, it is abstruse not because it is paradoxical and difficult to understand. It's abstruse in the Tao sense that it is abstracted out of the chaotic language that makes illusion and brought into the higher level where language speaks only truth. And because it speaks only truth, those of us who are used to struggling with the details of illusion hear this kind of exacting truth with kind of incomprehension at first. The way to approach this scale of material is not to peck away at it in worldly terms, but to undergo transformation in oneself and raise yourself up to where that language is real. So the whole Taoist, the whole import of what Lao Tzu is saying, here is for you a language which is real, and you can, by transformation, bring yourself up and speak that very language yourself. How will you know that what I say is true? You, by this, will know. By your, the Chinese phrase is zi jiang, means self-sowness. By your own self-sowness, you will know. Because you yourself will speak this language this way. You will find yourself in saying exactly what you now know to be. You will say it this way. So that the mystical sense of Lao Tzu rises here to like an apex. and the religious way of talking about this is that every time a human being raises themselves up to be able to speak truthful language, regardless of where they have come from on the planet, they all speak the same way, so that through the ages, the speech and wisdom of all mankind is like a choir singing the same hymn. God likes to hear that hymn. He likes to know that people still remember what's what. And he wants to hear it from us. Because every time one of us is able to speak language in that way, it is true in such a way that the resonance of that truth reigns upon the world in a kind of an unconscious light. In Buddhism, the experience in China was so devastating. Not devastating in a negative sense, but devastating in an illusion-busting sense. And Buddhism in China came up with the notion of the Amitabha Buddha, who in the Western paradise, by the radiance of his truthfulness, his truthful language, sends out invisible beams throughout all of the universe, so that anytime we begin to approach speaking truthfully, the magnetic attraction of the truth of the Buddha's language in the Western paradise draws us to him. And so it's very easy to learn to speak truthful language. It's hard to speak truthful language on the wing-spread angelic range of Lao Tzu. That's very difficult to do. Maybe one person in 200 billion could ever speak that way. But what is the tact taken in the wisdom tradition? The tact taken is you don't have to speak as broadly as that. Not everyone does. You can bring in the capacity, your range, so that you bring it in so that you need to only speak one word, or even just one syllable. You can always speak one syllable truthfully, and if you can, say it. So that the Prajnaparamita literature, the perfection of wisdom literature in China and India, came to this wonderful synthesis about the time of Plotinus in the West, of saying the shortest sutra on universal truth is the Prajnaparamita Sutra in one syllable, A. And with that genius, high Asian wisdom came to glorious realization. Anyone can learn enough about themselves to say one syllable truthfully. And if you do, this is Amitabha Buddhism, then the Buddha will reach out to you with his comprehension and pull you into enlightenment. Because even one syllable uttered truthfully has resonance with the real. Even one point of contact, nevertheless, is contact with the real. And because the real is compassionate and welcomes, all one has to do is to learn to speak truth, at least in one syllable once in your life. Now, this is making a 25-lane superhighway out of the yoga of self-realization and bringing it right to your doorstep. But they do not go into your living room. They bring that 25-lane highway right to your doorstep, but you have to make the decision to open the door and step on that road once. As soon as you put that one red shoe out there, that good lady comes down on that moonbeam and says, "You got it. You got it." Now that was the high Dharma joy about 1700 years ago in Asia, when Taoism and Buddhism came into a synergy, and Lao Tzu was read at the same level as one read the Buddha. And India and China came not as a parallel, but came as a complementation. I know our time is just about out. Let's try one more time, imaging the mysterious, and we'll leave for the evening. Chapter 25, the Cosmology chapter in the Tao Te Ching, the most important single document of Chinese philosophy or Chinese religion. There being everything's completion before heaven and earth exists, calm, oh, incorporeal, oh, alone stands, yet not changes, everywhere goes, yet not resisted, thereby become heaven earth's mother. I not know its name, characterize itself, called down. Forest become name itself, called great. Great called elusive. Elusive called distant. Distant called returning. For great, heaven great, earth great, king also great. This world has four greats, yet king dwells therein, one only. Gem follow earth, earth follow heaven, heaven follow Tao, Tao follows its self-sowness. And we'll stop there.